This is Sleeping in Trees, the audiobook. Chapter 14, The Young Boy and the Sea. I didn't see the appeal of racing sailboats, but in a sailing family, the regatta life was hard to avoid. Sail and race was what we did. My parents urged us all forward. Mom and Dad enjoyed Ding's success immensely, and the whole yacht club scene that went right along with it. Surprisingly, there was little pretension. It wasn't about prestige at all. Our club was a serious sailors' establishment. No tennis courts, no spa. The members were all just regular people with a passion for sailing and winning. They liked nothing more than watching their offspring do the same. Try to visualize Little League on Biscayne Bay. It was a very natural thing that my parents expected all of their other sons to fall in line and, tiller in hand, head out on the bay to extend the winning ways of their heavily decorated older brother. Let's just say Lobster was unengaged with the whole regatta thing. His preference was to spearfish, hunt for crabs and crawfish. He also wanted to be in the water, not on it. Lobster liked power and speed. Sailing simply left him cold. He used to tell me that watching a regatta was just a smidgen less exciting than watching grass grow. It was not long before Mom and Dad would be looking straight past Lobster and directly to their next prospect, me. I had other issues, mainly fear. I weighed all of 50 pounds at that point. It is known that weight plays a major part in the physics of wind, water, and sailboats. The lighter the skipper and crew, the faster the boat can sail. The other side of the formula states that the lighter the skipper and crew, the harder the boat is to manage. This was usually the world I operated in. To be clear, heavy wind scared the wits out of me. It did not take much of a breeze to place me only marginally in control of the craft, or not in control of it at all. Since wind conditions often change quickly out on Biscayne Bay, I really had no idea, once I pushed off from the dock, what I was in for. Thus, I soon equated regattas with a frightening unpredictability. Miami's Biscayne Bay was shallow and the water lukewarm most of the year. Though not deep, I still couldn't hope to touch the bottom, nor did I desire to, given the army of pincher crabs I was certain patrolled it. And at barely 4 feet tall, the 8-foot pram I was urged to race was twice my height. The water in the bay was also not clear. It was usually a muddy, grayish-brown with only a couple feet of visibility. A sailor never really knew what was underneath the boat. This was not really a big deal while the sailor was in the boat, but the sailor was not always in the boat, and I, a 50-pound sailor, half the size of the boat, stood a fairly good chance of being that sailor. We knew from experience that there was a variety of wildlife in the Atlantic Ocean, which the bay bled into a few miles out. Lobster confirmed this. He had numerous reference books that detailed a wide variety of creatures, large and small, that inhabited the Atlantic. While there were snapper, grouper, yellowtail, jack, marlin, mudfish, and mullet, there were also stingrays, jellyfish, pincher crabs, barracudas, and, of course, sharks. Hammerhead, white tip, and mako, just to start. Great whites, they prefer cold water, not on the list. Not surprisingly, I was scared to death of falling into the bay water, much less staying in it for more than a few terrifying seconds. In my view, there was just too much that could go horribly wrong from below. The proper nautical term for a sailboat that overturns is capsize. As wind speed increases, the odds of capsizing increase geometrically. There are numerous defensive strategies the sailor can deploy to stay upright in heavy wind. Let the sail out to bleed off the wind's force in the event a gust blasts across the bow. Head off or downwind by steering away from the gust. Hike further out over the side of the boat against the wind with feet hooked under the transom straps to shift the center of gravity out over the water against the wind. All these work well in their own special ways. Sometimes, if the wind is exceptionally heavy, all can be utilized at the same time to avoid the dreaded capsize. The 8-foot prams we raced were made of wood. They were chunky, maybe 70 pounds, so a young sailor struggled to move one around. During a race in moderate to heavy wind, they would constantly take on water. Because they had no built-in drainage system, the sailor had to continually bail with a plastic scoop that was tethered inside the boat with a piece of thin line. Bailers were usually made by cutting off the bottom of a gallon jug of Clorox. Not only was the sailor challenged to steer the craft and trim the sail just so, he or she had to bail as well to keep from being swamped. There could be a lot going on, and, depending on wind and temperature, racing was sometimes very hard work. The good news is that while a capsized pram can become submerged, it cannot really sink, at least not very quickly. If the sailor had the misfortune of flipping over, once righted, the boat would simply end up full to the gunnels with water. The pram became a waterlogged, floating, rectangular wooden box, with no meaningful way to control it. The sailor's main goal in such a predicament is to hold on gingerly and try to keep the centerboard and rudder from floating away. They were basically quite powerless and had to drift along with the semi-submerged craft until someone in another boat arrived with enough power to tow them back to shore. In the end, capsizing was not preferred. Winter racing was my least favorite competition. Not only was the wind usually howling, it did actually get quite chilly in South Florida in January. A bracing 20-knot wind with 60-degree temperatures can get frigid out on a bay, especially if the choppy water was sending up cold spray into the sailor's face every few seconds, which it was. With young kids, racing is always an intense competition. They all want to win. Their families desire the same result. However tastefully and tactfully one tries to spin it, in the end, they all want you, the opposition, to lose. While offering words of encouragement and feigning good sportsmanship, in reality, the racer's entire family just wants to see you trounced by their son, daughter, sister, or brother. For some, including me, this competitive dynamic was unpleasant. Spending an entire weekend after a tedious week of academic competition in an environment where most of the people I engaged with also wanted to crush me, to my thinking, was just not a whole lot of fun. Other options might include shooting land crabs with my slingshot or dodging large colored snails while climbing to the top of a banyan tree, or riding my bike with my buddies to Rock Lake, or watching Tarzan on TV. Add it all up, and I did not want to race prams on Biscayne Bay. I pushed back, made excuses, and pretended I was sick. I even tried telling my parents I was deathly afraid of sharks, was just too small, could be hit in the head by a flying boom, could capsize and drift out to sea, and possibly even drown. Nothing worked. They were not listening to me. They wanted me racing prams. They were as insistent as I was resistant. The tension would build by midweek like a cumulonimbus cloud out over the Everglades. My mother would talk about the upcoming series and who my competitors were to be. My anxiety would rise. She delighted in discussing strategy, the condition of my pram, and the likely weather, including the direction of the wind, onshore or offshore breeze. Regardless of wind speed, to her, everything was a breeze. As she amped and ramped it up into Friday, my stress increased as another highly competitive, boring regatta would soon be underway first thing Saturday morning, destined to ruin yet another weekend I'd much rather spend with my neighborhood crew. The tussle continued. I was stressed and depressed, and the baton would soon be passed. Finally, acknowledging that a competitor in any sport who lacks passion will be unlikely to find winning ways, my parents took the logical next step. They offered a bribe. On a Sunday night in 1964, the Beatles arrived in our Miami home via the Ed Sullivan Show. Mr. Sullivan stiffly garbled a dry introduction. The mopheads fired up their electric guitars and While my dad grumbled in the background about long hair and 6-month fads, my brothers and I stared, mesmerized, in front of our black and white Magnavox TV. An immediate fan, I looked right past Paul, George, and John wailing up front and fixated, instead, on the Beatle in the back. Sitting up on a stage with his full set of dark gray pearl Ludwig drums. Ringo was the guy. Before long, I was beating and banging on everything in sight with my fingers and hands in time to one Beatles hit after another. The string would eventually reach an astounding 27 before they disbanded in 1970. To my brothers' and friends' delight, but my dad's utter disgust and dismay, the 6-month fad exploded into a global revolution of rhythm and sound that soon buried Elvis and defined an entirely new culture of youth that engulfed the free world. The Beatles were a very big deal. Drum lessons began shortly thereafter. It started with a hard rubber practice pad on a small chrome stand and weekly lessons by a part-time drum teacher who came to the house. His other part-time job was playing in a local band. A few months into the groovy scene, I popped home after school one sunny day. My mom asked me to retrieve a mop for her from the closet underneath the stairs. I opened the door and nearly stumbled over a very shiny, all-chrome Ludwig snare drum and an 18-inch Zildjian cymbal. Life got loud. I was in the garage, getting ready to head to Coral Reef Yacht Club, lethargically pulling together my sailing gear, with just about as glum an attitude as I could muster. Dad came out through the kitchen door and pulled me aside. He told me that Mom and he had been talking and had come up with a capital idea. They both knew I could be a great sailor, if only I applied myself. I would likely win all kinds of trophies, just like my older brother, if I would just stick with it. As an incentive, they offered to complete my Ludwig drum set under one condition. I would have to race my small pram for 1 full year. I paused momentarily, and then quickly agreed, with but one stipulation. The drums had to be delivered up front. Never being one for a tough negotiation, Dad accepted my terms, and we shook on it as we stood in front of the clothes dryer and next to the big red Toro lawnmower. It was a midwinter day at the club, just like others before it, windy as heck, overcast and cold. While parents scurried about, helping the racers rig their prams, I went through the motions. Occasionally, I looked up at the flailing palm trees above me and on out to the windswept bay. There was a small spit of an island a few hundred yards offshore. Rarely was there much in the way of wave action in the sheltered but wide passage between us and the island. On this day, not only were there waves, there were whitecaps. It was blowing a gale. All we needed now to make it even more miserable were a few squalls, with thunderstorms mixed in. Rigging complete and foul weather gear donned, it was time to head out. One by one, the prams were loaded into the docking canal. Skippers hopped in, sheeted their sails, and tacked out toward the starting line. Navigating around the small island, the true weather revealed itself. It was as windy as I had ever seen it. Oddly, unless there was lightning and thunder, the parents on the committee boat rarely canceled a race. Sadly, I thought it looked like this one would go on as usual. I scanned the sky hoping for thunderheads, but was disappointed to find none in sight. The start of the race was always a bit chaotic and intense. At least under rules popular while I was sailing, it went something like this. Sail out to the imaginary starting line, an invisible demarcation zone that, if one could actually see it, laid between a bright, dead-glow orange floating buoy and the stern of the committee boat, about 50 yards apart. Tack back and forth up and down this line while dodging 20 other young racers trying to do the same thing. Keep a constant watch on the committee boat, your wristwatch and oncoming traffic. Don't cross the unseen line, but don't stray too far from it either. Just be near it. Wherever it is, follow the rules of maritime right-of-way at all times, while the competition attempts to do the same, if they have command of those rules. As the start nears, the committee boat will begin to raise different colored flags to alert all the sailors that the starting horn will soon blast. Watch out for oncoming craft. The position of the boat, starboard or port, determines which skipper must yield to another as numerous and repeated imminent head-on collisions loom. It's not unlike the game of chicken, though in a sailboat race there are some guidelines governing who must yield to whom before impact. In the event one knows the rules, generally the sailor approaching the other boat's starboard right side must yield, apply them with diligence, or risk a tedious protest meeting after the race, where the offended sailor's parents try their best to secure a disqualification. If successful, the young yachtsman's entire efforts, perhaps an entire weekend of intense competition, will have been for naught. It's one thing to correctly yield on open water on a broad tack. It's not too difficult, even for an amateur, to apply the simple starboard tack rule. Imagine jockeying for position with 20 other kids sailing head-on along an imaginary line, watching their watches in heavy wind, as all parties are continually wiggling the prows of their boats to and fro to either accelerate or slow down so they are in just the right spot at just the right moment when the starter blasts the horn. Whew! I nailed the start, exploding off the imaginary line way out front. My pram was vaulting across the waves, galloping before the raging wind. It felt like I was racing downhill. If only I could enjoy it. Every act, from gripping the tiller to steer the small bucking bronco, to reaching to raise the centerboard or trim in the sheet line, was on the edge of calamity. Such was the brutal attack of the wind and frothy waves around me. Within a few short minutes, the pack was hopelessly distanced in my wake. My featherweight body and pram were a true force. With even a middling strategy at this early point in the race, I knew that no one had a chance to catch me. In what seemed like a few moments, I tacked to the first mark. I would have to round it tightly, come about, and sheet the sail out to a broad reach, all in a few quick seconds, to avoid a slamming and snapping full sail, which could spin my tiny pram into a cartwheel. I made the turn and rounded the mark, barely holding on through the maneuver. I had executed a tack around the first mark exactly like this dozens of times, but never in such hair-raising, gale-force conditions. 15 minutes of high wind and cold spray were taking their toll. My hands were chilled and growing numb, and I was really struggling to hang on. I headed into a broad reach and accelerated into the highest speed of the race. My pram skipped across the white caps. I was scared witless. My teeth chattered, and I began to cry. We vaulted forward. I tacked a single time to gain the correct angle to the final mark and the run home. But I was in serious trouble. I had bungled my approach and was one tack short. Based on my trajectory, the last mark would require that I came fully about under the force of heavy wind. At that point, I was exhausted and was barely able to control the boat, no less execute a high wind tacking maneuver. As I raced into the mark, I calculated quickly that the odds of making a successful turn were near zero. My math was optimistic. Exhausted, freezing, numb, and terrified, I shoved the tiller full lock, ducked and yanked on the cleated sheet line in a feeble attempt to pop it free. It jammed. At a violent speed, the pram